continuing our journey through the bizarre, eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty. Let us remember that this wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking like you never had to work a day in your life. If you missed the start, don't worry. Just imagine a world where healthy meant you were probably milking cows. And beautiful meant you could afford to faint at will. Let's pick up where we left off with the medieval obsession for pale skin. If you thought today's beauty standards were tough, try living in a time when a healthy glow meant you were a peasant, and translucent skin meant you were basically royalty. But getting that ghostly look wasn't easy. Nature, being uncooperative, meant people had to get creative and, sometimes, downright dangerous. Noble women and even some noblemen would slather their faces in white lead powder. This gave them that signature corpse chic glow, and as a bonus, slowly poisoned them by, hey, beauty has always had its pride. Others soaked their skin in vinegar, or rubbed crushed pearls and egg whites onto their faces. Not only did this lighten the skin, but it also left cheeks feeling like a stale omelette. Some even painted blue veins onto their arms and chest to simulate delicacy. Because nothing says nobility like looking like your skin might split open at any moment. Romantic poems of the time described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and once like the moon in winter, which is just a poetic way of saying she looked like she might faint. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty. It was shorthand for class, purity, and a complete disengagement from agriculture. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning. But the medieval beauty game didn't stop at skin. There was also the curious obsession with high foreheads. A smooth, uninterrupted forehead was considered elegant, intelligent, and divined the architectural marvel of the medieval face. To achieve this, women plucked out their eyebrows entirely, and sometimes even shaved their hairline back inch by inch. This wasn't a trim, it was a full-on forehead expansion project. Grooming manuals advised using tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from things like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches. The results were striking. Portraits from the time show women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could host a joust on them. Combined with pale skin and soft features, this high-dome aesthetic became shorthand for refined beauty. Fashion supported the look to tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and those famous cone-shaped hats called hennins. All helped pull the hairline up, or at least hide where your eyebrows used to be. This wasn't just a castle trend from England to France to Italy. Noble women leaned into the high forehead style, while artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces began somewhere near the crown of the head. Not everyone could afford the time or tools to pluck themselves into perfection, so some women faked it by drawing their new forehead slightly higher and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That, right, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring, just with a lot more fabric. Eyebrows, by the way, were not just underappreciated, they were actively eliminated. Modern trends may celebrate bold brows, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or erased them entirely. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Some went even further and shaved a brow area completely, ensuring that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster, Hadome glory. The sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influencers blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back in. To remove the brows, medieval women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or, for the especially brave, mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Yes, arsenic. Because nothing says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. Art from the period from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits confirms the trend. Noble women are frequently depicted with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but skin. The result is either serene or slightly alien, depending on the lighting. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows persisted, especially as influences from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire filtered through trade and war. But by and large, the message was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to court life, occasionally trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement, though full removal was rare among males, unless they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. What this all tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a bit. Angels, after all, rarely have brows in art. Coincidence, possibly, but it worked for them. The rosy cheek dilemma in the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks, was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation. Beadille was a subtle blush-light. You just heard a mildly scandalous poem or stepped outdoors for 30 seconds. But not long enough to tan, heaven forbid. A gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, tender general of all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing color on their faces unless, of course, they were nobility or doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area scholars are still trying to define. Still, women improvise. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even coccinella, deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs, because beauty has never been kind. Some simply rubbed their cheeks to get that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment. dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both clergy and judgmental neighbors. For the wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were incredibly toxic. But a logic when something like, "I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and socially respected." Rouge was typically applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Mirror access was limited. So many women relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. If your blush was too visible, you might be accused of imitating prostitutes, or as French courtiers, the horror. The goal was always modest enhancement, not theatrical statement. And if someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind. Even nuns occasionally wore a touch of rouge discreetly, and supposedly only on feast days, because nothing says "I serve the Lord" like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind the cloister. Hair, the medieval gold standard in medieval Europe. If your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a bottle angel, you were already starting from behind. Blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and in case you needed divine backup, Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was, geographically speaking, almost certainly not. But realism was less important than radiance. If you were born blonde, congratulations, you were considered blessed and probably got out of a few chores. But natural blondness didn't last, especially in adulthood. So medieval women took matters into their own hands, and sometimes cauldrons. Homemade hair lightening concoctions included saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lime, applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sunbath. It worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes also included urine, which was thought to help lift color. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, it was deemed worth it. Beauties, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. Hair texture mattered, too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women. Once married, your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, and head wraps. Because apparently, the moment you said "I do," your hair became a national security risk. For noblewomen, hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case you needed to remind the room you didn't shear sheep for a living. Men weren't left out either. While not quite as judged, men with thick golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair, charging into battle, were the medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it, often unless you were trying to get married. Then suddenly, it became a strategic asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose, as a symbol of purity and innocence, though not too loose. Unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations. You now had a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery-esque wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and Kohaisa, medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical. B protect its hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments from troubadours. The most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The effect, you looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was the goal. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear got more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into geometric shapes. And some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bell spigots. Nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. In many cultures, concealed hair was tied to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night or worse, a French woman. Of course, some women rebel. They would let a little curl slip out or wear translucent veils that technically counted as covered while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. The hennin, medieval social ladder you wore. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 10th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. You know, those towering cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples. The hennin wasn't just headwear, it was a social ladder you wore. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet, sometimes even more especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner. Often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade, hennins were structured with wire frames, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Now, getting your hair to fit under one of these things was an art in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead real estate, again to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief. But hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped discs, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennin. Wear-veils were spread out, like wings great for drama, not so much for rain. Outside of nobility, most women stuck with veils, linen caps, or circlets simpler, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused. Be warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Still, hennons remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering combs, they had their own style statements. Think feathered cap, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that could double as fencing equipment. Be medieval body, delicate, demure, and possibly fainting in medieval times. A woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal-like. Someone who lived on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps one fig per week. Beauty manuals didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and maybe swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least, not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was associated with nobility, because, of course, if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the misfortune of muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched, just below the bust-stand, early version of the empire waist, to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Not quite corsets, those came later, but tightly bound coats. And girdles did the job just fine. Being too thin, however, wasn't the goal either. For in times of famine or plague, being very thin was a red flag, as in that person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered healthy and fertile. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic, you were in a sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for breath, and drinking wine to improve complexion. Protein only if it had a feather still attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over. Even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not brute strength. Eyes, the silent power in the Middle Ages. A woman's eyes were her silent power, the medieval version of sending a flirty emoji, only with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue," and maybe just a hint of melancholy. Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely said was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, Or, I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes blue or grey were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired, too, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner, pens, gust, charcoal, soot, and optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around the lashes to make the eyes look bigger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more white. Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous. Look downward at all times, even if you trip over the cot. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were admired. It suggested emotional sensitivity, perhaps that you just finished praying or reading something uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible but wasn't about to brag. Breath and teeth. The silent struggles. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love. Poetry. Breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. Or while a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept. And minty freshness wasn't invented, yet unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast. Though, statistically, you had medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs not, just for the taste, but to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the prime version of goom. It didn't sparkle your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, at least less terrifying in close conversation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly both because they were expensive, and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing, as we know it, wasn't standard. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used two stick-small, fibrous twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with, while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems like surviving winter or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noble women, the trick was to minimize offense while maintaining grace. Conversations took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited. And when in doubt, fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander-scented orb filled with herbs to wave gently in your own direction as needed. Teeth, the smile you rarely saw. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly like spices or peasant revolt. Ooh, why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by age 30. So, the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and medand, lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism with pliers. Despite this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare and seen as a mark of youth and fortune and burr. People weren't going around flashing big, toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure, closed-lip smile was far more fashionable. Think I might be contemplating a sonnet, rather than I am thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they, too, were quietly aware of the risks of showing molly. Men weren't immune, either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line, "His teeth gleamed like ivory." There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands not breath, and bite alignment.